In the whispers of ancient bamboo scrolls, she waits, a shadow between myth and memory. Across the windswept steppes where golden grasses bow beneath endless skies, her story breathes. Not in flourishes of fantasy, but in the quiet strength of a daughter's devotion. Listen as silk banners ripple through centuries, as armor weighs upon slender shoulders concealed, as hoofbeats echo through mountain passes long silent. Here lies not just a warrior's tale, but the soul of a civilization, where duty flowed like rivers, family stood eternal as mountains, and courage bloomed delicate, yet unyielding as spring plum blossoms against winter's retreat. If this journey into history gently moves you, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here. By the way, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment before you drift off. We read every single one. Before we can understand Mulan, we must first journey across the landscapes that shaped her world. The vast territories of northern China during the Northern Wei Dynasty, 386–534 CE, the most likely historical setting of her tale, stretched beneath sprawling skies where clouds raced like celestial horses. This was a realm where the Great Wall stood as a stone dragon across mountain ridges, where settled agricultural communities lived in constant awareness of the nomadic peoples beyond. These northern borderlands existed in perpetual transition between worlds, between the agricultural civilization of the Central Plains and the nomadic steppe cultures of the north. Here, the heart of Chinese civilization met its other, creating a cultural borderland as significant as the physical one. Winters brought bitter winds sweeping down from the Mongolian plateau, carrying with them the distant sounds of hoofbeats that might signal trade caravans or raiding parties. Springs arrived late but transformed the landscape with surprising gentleness as wildflowers pushed through frost-hardened earth in displays of delicate perseverance. The people of these borderlands lived lives forged by necessity and adaptability. Villages clustered in river valleys or against protective mountain slopes, their mud brick homes arranged in compounds where extended families shared courtyards, protective walls, and communal ovens. Daily life followed the agricultural rhythm, planting millet and wheat when the soil softened, tending livestock that grazed on surrounding hillsides, harvesting before autumn winds signaled winter's approach. Women spun hemp and wove fabric during cold months, while men repaired tools and fortifications. Yet unlike the more insulated communities of central China, these border settlements existed in a state of perpetual readiness. Watchtowers dotted hillsides, and even children learned to recognize the difference between dust clouds raised by returning herds and those signaling approaching horsemen. Young men trained with bows and practiced horsemanship, not merely as sport, but as essential survival skills. Young women, while primarily focused on domestic arts and filial responsibilities, often developed proficiencies uncommon in the inner provinces. Riding, basic self-defense, and sometimes even archery became necessary knowledge in regions where danger might arrive with little warning. It was against this backdrop that the Northern Wei Dynasty emerged, itself a manifestation of cultural fusion, founded by the Tuoba clan of the Xianbei people. This non-Han dynasty gradually adopted Chinese governmental systems while maintaining distinctive cultural elements of their steppe heritage. Their rule represented a fascinating historical paradox. Foreign conquerors who became the preservers and promoters of traditional Chinese culture, particularly Confucian principles and Buddhist faith. The Northern Wei rulers strategically relocated their capital to Luoyang in 494 CE, embracing Sinicization, the adoption of Han Chinese culture, dress, language, and customs, while simultaneously maintaining military strength through their cavalry traditions. This created a cultural landscape where multiple influences coexisted, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes in tension. The imperial court might conduct ceremonies according to Confucian ritual in the morning, while the emperor retired to a felt tent in the palace gardens by evening, maintaining connections to his ancestral traditions. For common people, especially, Those in border regions, this cultural fusion manifested in daily life. Traditional Chinese family structures, with their emphasis on filial piety and ancestral veneration, operated alongside pragmatic adaptations to frontier living. Households might burn incense at ancestral tablets before dawn, then send daughters alongside sons to help with herding by midday. A family might speak a regional dialect rich with Xianbei loanwords while teaching children to write in classical Chinese characters. This was a world of syncretic religious practice as well. Buddhism flourished under Northern Wei patronage, with magnificent cave temples at Yungang and Longmen serving as testament to imperial devotion. Yet in villages and homes, Buddhism merged with older folk religions, ancestor worship, and sometimes shamanistic practices brought by steppe peoples. Heaven remained above, earth below, and humans navigated the complex relationships between them through rituals both ancient and evolving. The Northern Wei dynasty, like many before it, faced the perennial challenge of securing its northern frontier. Beyond the Great Wall, itself not a single structure, but a series of fortifications built, abandoned, and rebuilt by successive dynasties, lay the vast grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. This seemingly endless expanse of grass and sky was home to various nomadic peoples who followed seasonal migration patterns with their herds of horses, sheep, cattle, and camels. Chief among these nomadic groups during the Northern Wei period were the Rouran Khaganate, a confederation of Mongolic peoples who dominated the eastern steppe from the late 4th to the mid-6th century. The relationship between the settled agricultural society of Northern Wei China and the mobile pastoral society of the Rouran was complex, characterized by trade, tribute, diplomatic marriages, and episodic warfare. When resources grew scarce, or political circumstances favored aggression, Rouran forces would mount raids across the frontier. Their fighting style emphasized mobility, surprise, and overwhelming speed. Hundreds of mounted archers appearing suddenly from the horizon, loose formations allowing them to envelope slower-moving infantry, and the ability to withdraw as quickly as they arrived, often before defensive forces could properly mobilize. These border conflicts created an atmosphere where military service was an expected part of life for families in the frontier regions. The Northern Wei maintained a system of hereditary military households, where sons were expected to follow fathers into martial service. This conscription system formed the backbone of defensive capabilities along the northern frontier, supplemented by professional soldiers and, in times of significant threat, broader mobilization of able-bodied men. It was precisely this military obligation, falling upon households regardless of whether they had suitable male heirs, that forms the historical context for the Mulan legend. When raiding parties struck across the border or larger military campaigns were launched, the call would go out to military households to provide their service. Drums would sound in command posts along the frontier, and families would prepare to send their sons to assemble at designated collection points, bearing whatever equipment their station in life afforded them. The physical geography that would have surrounded the historical Mulan shaped not only military realities, but cultural consciousness. The northern frontier was a land of dramatic contrast, austere beauty alongside harsh conditions. Winters brought temperatures that plunged well below freezing, with winds that could strip flesh from bone. Summers delivered intense heat across plains where shade was a precious commodity. Spring and autumn offered brief reprieves of moderate weather, when wildflowers carpeted hillsides and leaves turned golden against azure skies. Mountains rose in craggy formations, creating natural defensive positions and passages that armies contested for strategic control. Rivers cut through valleys, their waters bringing life to agricultural communities and serving as transportation arteries in peacetime or defensive barriers during conflict. Forests of pine, oak, and birch clung to north-facing slopes, providing timber for construction and fuel for the long winters. Villages in this region typically centered around a protective core, sometimes a rudimentary fort or watchtower, sometimes simply a communal building where villagers could gather in times of danger. Homes were built for practicality rather than beauty, with thick walls to insulate against seasonal temperature extremes and small windows that limited heat loss while also providing security. In more prosperous areas, larger towns featured markets where local products were exchanged, governmental outposts where officials collected taxes and administered imperial decrees, and temples where both state-sanctioned rituals and folk religious practices took place. The rhythm of life followed both agricultural and military necessities. Planting and harvest defined the year's primary structure, with winter serving as a time of domestic activities, weaving, tool repair, food preservation, and education of children. Yet overlaid upon this agricultural calendar was the persistent awareness of security concerns. Festival celebrations might be interrupted by signal fires announcing approaching danger, and young men's coming-of-age ceremonies increasingly emphasized martial skills alongside traditional scholarship. For women in these frontier communities, life demanded resilience beyond what might be expected in more secure interior regions. While Confucian ideals of female virtue, centered around the three obediences to father, husband, and grown son, remained the social standard, practical reality often required women to assume responsibilities beyond traditional domestic roles. When men departed for military service, women managed not only households but fields, finances, and community leadership. This created a social environment where female capability, though rarely celebrated in official histories, became an essential component of frontier survival. The story of Mulan comes to us first, not through official histories, but through poetry. Specifically, the Ballad of Mulan, or Mulan Shi. This folk poem, believed to have been composed during the Northern Wei Dynasty and first transcribed during the Tang Dynasty, 618–907 CE, provides the earliest known account of the woman warrior who would become one of China's most enduring cultural figures. The poem's anonymous authorship and oral transmission before written documentation suggest its origins in folk tradition rather than court literature. The ballad opens with Mulan sitting at her loom, a quintessentially feminine occupation in traditional Chinese society. Yet even in these opening lines, we find her distracted, her thoughts not on the shuttle moving back and forth, but on the military conscription notices that have been issued. Her father is old, her brother too young, and so, in the night, she purchases a horse and weapons to take her father's place in the army. For 12 years, according to the poem, she serves in the military without her sex being discovered. She fights in battles, earns military merit, and is even offered official positions when the army returns victorious. Yet she declines honors and rewards, asking only for a swift horse to carry her home. Only when she returns home and changes back into women's clothes do her former comrades express shock at discovering her true gender. The ballad concludes with a simple yet profound metaphor. When male and female rabbits run side by side, how can one distinguish between them? This poetic question challenges the rigid gender distinctions of traditional Chinese society, while simultaneously affirming Mulan's return to conventional gender roles once her filial duty is complete. This literary foundation, poetic rather than historical, presents our first challenge in uncovering the real Mulan. Unlike figures such as Emperor Wu of Han or Empress Wu Zetian, Mulan appears in no official dynastic histories. No archaeological evidence attests directly to her existence. No contemporary accounts mention a woman warrior serving in disguise. What we have instead is a powerful narrative that has endured for approximately 1,500 years, a story that has resonated across generations and cultures precisely because it speaks to universal themes of duty, sacrifice, gender expectations, and familial devotion. While confirming Mulan's historical existence remains elusive, examining the historical possibility of her story proves more fruitful. Despite Confucian ideology that emphasized strict gender separation and female submission, Chinese history does provide examples of women who took up arms in various contexts. Archaeological evidence from nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples along China's northern frontier reveals that women among these groups sometimes participated in warfare. Tombs of women buried with weapons and riding equipment have been discovered from various steppe cultures, suggesting that gender roles among these Peoples allowed for female military participation more readily than among the agricultural Han Chinese. The Northern Wei Dynasty's Xianbei origins could have created cultural space for such gender flexibility, particularly in border regions where practical necessity often outweighed ideological constraints. Historical records also mention exceptional cases of women leading military forces, though typically in desperate circumstances rather than through standard recruitment. The most famous example comes from the Han Dynasty, when the widow Fu Hao led forces against enemy armies. Later dynasties would record instances of women defending cities when male leaders had fallen or organizing resistance against invaders. These cases, however, were invariably framed as extraordinary responses to crisis rather than normal military service. The disguise element of Mulan's story also finds some historical parallels. Chinese history includes scattered accounts of women disguising themselves as men to access opportunities otherwise denied them, to pursue education, escape unwanted marriages, or follow lovers to distant posts. The effectiveness of such disguises was aided by military attire of the period, which featured substantial armor, helmets that obscured facial features, and loose-fitting uniforms that could conceal body shape. Extended campaigns in harsh conditions, where soldiers rarely had opportunities for bathing or privacy, would have further facilitated such deception. The Northern Wei military conscription system provides a plausible historical context for Mulan's motivations. The hereditary military household system, Binghu-ji, required families registered as military households to provide one male member for service when called upon. If a family had no able-bodied adult male, if the father was elderly, and sons too young or non-existent, the family faced penalties, potentially including financial ruin through heavy taxation or forced labor. A daughter disguising herself to fulfill this obligation would be acting not merely out of emotional attachment to her father, but from practical necessity to preserve her family's welfare. While the historical Mulan may remain elusive, her cultural impact is unmistakable. The evolution of her story across centuries provides insight into changing Chinese attitudes toward gender, duty, patriotism, and individual sacrifice. Each dynasty that embraced and reinterpreted her tale added layers of meaning reflective of their own values and concerns. During the Tang Dynasty, 618–907 CE, when the Ballad was first recorded in written form, China experienced relatively liberal attitudes toward women compared to later periods. Tang princesses learned horsemanship and sometimes hunted alongside male relatives, while urban women enjoyed comparatively free movement and educational opportunities. This cultural context may explain why the Tang transcription of the Ballad emphasizes Mulan's seamless movement between gender roles without moral condemnation. By the Song Dynasty, 960–1279 CE, Neo-Confucian philosophy had begun to emphasize a more rigid gender separation and female chastity. A 12th century play titled Mulan Joins the Army introduced new elements to her story, most notably the addition of a love interest and greater emphasis on maintaining her virginal purity despite the dangers of camp life. This adaptation reflected Song society's increased preoccupation with female sexual virtue while still celebrating Mulan's filial devotion. The Ming Dynasty, 1368–1644 CE, saw further elaboration of the legend with the publication of Romance of Sui and Tang, providing the most detailed narrative yet. This version introduced the surname Hua for Mulan, expanded her military exploits into detailed campaigns, and emphasized her refusal to marry after her service as a dedication to her parents. This interpretation aligned with Ming-era emphasis on chastity and filial piety as supreme female virtues. By the Qing Dynasty, 1644–1912 CE, Mulan had been fully incorporated into the pantheon of exemplary women celebrated in Confucian morale, education. The gathered accounts of filial piety included her story alongside other filial daughters, emphasizing her motivation as primarily concern for her father rather than patriotism or personal ambition. This interpretation stripped away elements of gender transgression by framing her male disguise as temporary, and her martial prowess as secondary to her filial heart. Throughout these retellings, certain core elements remained consistent. Mulan's filial motivation, her military competence, her preservation of feminine virtue despite masculine disguise, and her ultimate return to conventional female roles. These constants suggest that Chinese culture could celebrate female martial capability only when it was motivated by proper values, family rather than personal ambition, and temporary rather than transformative of gender boundaries. To understand the potential historical Mulan, we must examine more closely the specific context of the Northern Wei dynasty, the setting most scholars consider most likely for her story. The Northern Wei period represents a fascinating moment of cultural convergence when non-Han rulers adopted Chinese governmental structures while maintaining elements of their nomadic heritage. Emperor Xiaowen, reign 471-499 CE, instituted comprehensive reforms known as Sinicization, which included adoption of Chinese language, clothing, surnames, and Confucian court rituals. These policies aim to legitimize Xianbei rule over the majority Han population while creating administrative continuity with earlier Chinese dynasties. However, these changes often remained superficial at court and even less thoroughgoing among common people, especially in frontier regions where practical concerns outweighed ideological conformity. Gender roles during this period reflected this cultural hybridity, while official Confucian doctrine emphasized the inner-outer dichotomy that restricted women to domestic spaces and men to public life. Actual practice, especially among families of Xianbei origin or in border regions, often allowed women greater freedom of movement and activity. Xianbei women traditionally had participated in skills like horseback riding and archery that would have been considered inappropriate for Han women of the interior provinces. The Northern Wei military system combined elements from Chinese and steppe traditions, based primarily on hereditary military households supplemented by tribal forces. Northern Wei armies particularly valued cavalry skills derived from their nomadic heritage, the necessity of defending against other steppe peoples, particularly the Rouran, created constant demand for military service along the northern frontier. These campaigns were not merely defensive, but sometimes involved deep penetration into steppe territories to disrupt nomadic confederations before they could organize larger threats, precisely the type of extended, distant campaign described in the Ballad of Mulan. Archaeological discoveries from Northern Wei tombs reveal material culture that combined Chinese and steppe elements. Bronze belt plaques decorated with animal motifs alongside ceramic vessels of Chinese design. Hardwood, bows of nomadic style alongside iron weapons in Chinese military tradition. This material hybridity mirrors the cultural fusion that characterized the dynasty and created possibilities for cultural spaces where traditional gender boundaries might prove more permeable than in regions more thoroughly dominated by orthodox Confucianism. If a historical woman did inspire the Mulan legend, she would have lived in this cultural borderland, ethnically perhaps part Xianbei, part Han, geographically positioned where practical frontier needs sometimes outweighed ideological constraints, and temporally situated in a dynasty where multiple cultural traditions coexisted in dynamic tension. This specific historical context doesn't confirm Mulan's existence, but it does suggest the plausibility of her story in ways that other periods of Chinese history might not have allowed. Network of allies. These tribal connections proved vital for survival and trade in the harsh northern landscape. In these communities, women often played crucial roles beyond domestic duties, sometimes even participating in hunting or defense when needed. The Xianbei, one of the nomadic groups that would have been contemporary with the historical Mulan, had customs where women retained considerable independence. Archaeological findings from Xianbei burial sites reveal women interred with weapons and riding gear, suggesting some women may have indeed engaged in martial activities. While not the norm, these exceptions to gender roles might have provided the historical foundation for the legend that would later become the Ballad of Mulan. In this world of blurred boundaries between settled and nomadic life, a young woman like Mulan would have grown up understanding the rhythms of both agricultural cycles and seasonal migrations. The winters would have brought biting winds sweeping down from the Mongolian steppes, forcing families to huddle in homes partially sunk into the earth for insulation. Summer would bring the urgent tasks of cultivation, harvesting, and preparation for the harsh seasons ahead. The Northern Wei, founded by the Tuoba clan of the Xianbei people, represented a fascinating cultural amalgamation. While initially preserving their nomadic traditions, the rulers gradually adopted Chinese administrative practices and cultural elements. This process of Sinicization accelerated after the court moved its capital to Luoyang in 494 CE, deeper into traditional Chinese territory. Emperor Xiaowen, who ruled from 471 to 499 CE, implemented significant reforms that mandated the adoption of Han Chinese surnames, clothing and language among the Xianbei elite. These policies created a complex social environment where ethnic identities were becoming increasingly fluid. For common people living along the borderlands, daily life consisted of navigating these multiple cultural influences while focusing on the immediate concerns of survival. The military structure of Northern Wei China, the likely setting for the historical Mulan, differed significantly from earlier and later dynasties. Unlike the conscription system of the Han Dynasty or the professional armies of the Tang, the Northern Wei initially relied heavily on tribal warriors and a system of military households. Under this system, certain families were designated as military households with hereditary obligation to provide soldiers. A family would be required to send at least one able-bodied male to serve when called upon, while the remaining family members continued agricultural production to support both themselves and the war effort. This created a semi-professional military where soldiers maintained connections to their home villages rather than being quartered permanently in frontier garrisons. For families with no adult males, the burden could become particularly onerous. Historical records from the period occasionally mention cases where elderly fathers, young boys, or even women disguised as men were sent to fulfill these obligations when no suitable male was available. These instances, though rare, provide a plausible historical context for the Mulan legend, a daughter taking her aging father's place to satisfy a military quota. The equipment of a Northern Wei soldier would have included a combination of Chinese and steppe influences. A typical infantry soldier might wear lamellar armor made of small iron or leather plates laced together, providing flexible protection. Cavalrymen, particularly those of nomadic heritage, might wear lighter leather armor to maintain mobility. The primary weapons included the bow and arrow, various polearms like the Ji, a combination of spear and dagger axe, and straight double-edged swords. Military training focused on horsemanship and archery, skills that were often taught from childhood. In frontier communities, the most prized skill was mounted archery, the ability to shoot accurately while riding at gallop. This tactic, borrowed from steppe warfare traditions, formed the backbone of Northern Wei military strategy and would have been exceptional for a woman to master secretly, as the legend suggests Mulan did. The Northern Wei faced ongoing conflicts with neighboring peoples, including the Rouran Khaganate to the north, various Turkic tribes to the northwest, and the remnants of Chinese dynasties to the south. These persistent threats required regular military campaigns, particularly along the northern frontiers, where the Great Wall marked the symbolic boundary between agricultural China and the nomadic steppes. Military campaigns typically began in spring after the thaw allowed for troop movements and continued until autumn when supplies became scarce. Winter campaigns were rare due to the harsh climate of northern China. For soldiers, life during these campaigns was grueling. Marching long distances carrying heavy equipment, setting up temporary camps, and facing the constant threat of ambush or pitched battle. Within these armies, soldiers were organized into units of varying sizes, from squads of 5 men to divisions of thousands. The chain of command was strict, with punishments for disobedience ranging from beatings to execution. Discipline was maintained through a combination of harsh penalties and rewards for valor. Successful soldiers could be granted land, titles, or valuable goods, providing incentives for service beyond mere obligation. For a woman disguised as a man in such an environment, maintaining her secret would have required extraordinary caution. Privacy was minimal in military camps, with soldiers eating, sleeping, and bathing in close proximity. The legends claim that Mulan served for a decade or more without discovery speaks to both her ingenuity and the literary embellishment that typically accompanies folklore. Archaeological evidence from the period has revealed camps and garrison sites along the northern frontier. Excavations have uncovered military equipment, personal effects, and evidence of daily life for these soldier farmers. Among these findings are occasional anomalies, burial sites of individuals whose biological sex does not match their military dress and equipment. While these cannot be definitively linked to female warriors like Mulan, they hint at the complex gender dynamics that may have existed in frontier societies. The military structure also included non-combat roles that were essential to campaign success. Logistics officers managed supplies, while military physicians treated wounds and illness. Interpreters facilitated communication with allied or enemy forces speaking different languages. These specialized positions sometimes offered opportunities for educated individuals who lacked physical strength, another possible avenue through which a woman might have served without immediate discovery. As campaigns progressed, the armies would establish supply lines back to agricultural centers, with regular caravans bringing food, weapons, and other necessities to the front. Protecting these supply routes became as important as direct confrontation with enemy forces. Strategic thinking in this period focused as much on controlling resources and territory as on battlefield victories. For soldiers of common birth, military service represented both burden and opportunity. While dangerous and demanding, it offered potential social mobility in a society otherwise rigidly stratified. Extraordinary service could elevate a commoner to official status, granting privileges and respect otherwise unattainable. This aspect of military service appears prominently in the Mulan Ballad, where her achievements eventually earn her an audience with the emperor himself. During the Northern Wei period, another significant development was the growing influence of Buddhism within military culture. Buddhist temples increasingly performed rituals intended to protect armies and ensure victory. Soldiers might carry small Buddha figures or sutras as protective talismans. This spiritual dimension added another layer to military life, with commanders sometimes consulting monks or other religious figures before major campaigns. The vows of filial piety that underpin the Mulan narrative, a daughter sacrificing for her father's well-being, reflect the deep cultural value placed on family obligation in Chinese society. This ethic extended into military service, where soldiers were reminded that their efforts protected not just abstract concepts of state or dynasty, but their actual homes and families. The most compelling motivation for soldiers was often not loyalty to the emperor, but concern for their own communities. The life of women in ancient China varied considerably by social class, geographic region, and historical period. During the Northern Wei era, when the legend of Mulan likely originated, women's experiences reflected a blend of Han Chinese traditions and more flexible steppe customs brought by the ruling Xianbei people. For women of the peasant class, which constituted the vast majority of the population, daily life centered around agricultural labor and household management. The strict gender segregation emphasized in Confucian texts was often impractical for farming families who needed every hand for survival. Women worked alongside men in fields during planting and harvest seasons, while also managing domestic responsibilities including food preparation, textile production, and childcare. Textile work held particular importance in women's lives. The processes of spinning thread, weaving cloth, and creating garments were essential economic contributions. Archaeological findings from Northern Wei sites have uncovered numerous spinning whorls and loom weights in household contexts, testifying to the ubiquity of these activities. The Ballad of Mulan references this directly in its opening lines, where Mulan sits at her loom before departing for war, an image that would have resonated deeply with its original audience. Marriage generally occurred early, with girls often betrothed in childhood and married in their mid-teens. For common families, marriage represented not just a personal union, but an economic alliance between households. Brides typically moved to their husband's family home, where they were subject to the authority of their mothers-in-law. This transition could be particularly difficult, as young women left familiar surroundings to join households where they initially held little status or authority. A woman's position within her husband's family improved gradually as she bore children, particularly sons who would continue the family line. The relationship between mothers and sons was one of the few avenues through which women could exercise significant influence in family affairs. As mothers aged and their sons established their own households, they could eventually attain considerable authority over daughters-in-law and grandchildren. Despite the patriarchal structure of society, historical and archaeological evidence suggests that women's experiences were more varied and complex than prescriptive texts might indicate. Legal codes from the Northern Wei period show that women could own property, initiate divorce under certain circumstances, and pursue limited legal claims. Tombstone inscriptions occasionally praise women not just for domestic virtues, but for literary accomplishments or business acumen. Among the Xianbei elite who ruled the Northern Wei, women initially enjoyed greater freedom than their Han Chinese counterparts. Historical records mention Xianbei noble women riding horses, participating in hunts, and even offering political counsel, activities that would have been considered inappropriate for Han women of similar status. As the dynasty progressively adopted Chinese customs, however, these freedoms diminished for women of the ruling class. For women in frontier regions where the Mulan story originated, life incorporated elements of both settled agricultural patterns and nomadic traditions. Archaeological evidence from these regions shows women buried with a wider range of artifacts, including items associated with hunting and riding, suggesting more flexible gender roles than in the Chinese heartland. Religious life offered women certain spaces for community and expression outside the family structure. Buddhist nunneries, which expanded significantly during the Northern Wei period, provided alternative life paths for some women. The imperial family actively patronized Buddhism, with Empress Dowager Feng, 442-490 CE, sponsoring the creation of the Yungang grottos, magnificent cave temples that still stand today. Some elite women found intellectual and spiritual fulfillment through Buddhist practice and patronage. Education for women varied widely by social class. Elite families might provide daughters with literary education, though typically less extensive than their brothers received. Common women rarely had formal education, instead learning practical skills through apprenticeship with mothers and other female relatives. The literacy required to record a story like Mulan's would have been unusual among women of the frontier regions, suggesting that the earliest versions were likely transmitted orally before being written down by educated. Men-women's health concerns received attention through a developing tradition of gynecological medicine. Medical texts from the period discuss conditions specific to women and prescribe herbal remedies for everything from pregnancy complications to menstrual difficulties. For a woman disguised as a man in military service, managing these biological realities would have presented significant challenges not addressed in the romantically simplified Ballad. The legal status of women during this period reflected their subordinate social position, but included certain protections. Laws punished sexual assault and recognized women's claims to natal family property under specific circumstances. Women could not independently initiate most legal proceedings, but might be represented by male relatives. Criminal punishments for women often differed from those for men, sometimes being less severe for equivalent offenses. Foot binding, which would later become a defining aspect of women's lives in China, had not yet emerged during the Northern Wei period. Women of all classes maintained natural foot development, allowing for greater physical mobility than in later eras. This physical freedom would have been essential for a woman undertaking military service, as the legend claims Mulan did. The custom of widow chastity, the expectation that women would remain unmarried after their husbands' deaths, was gaining prominence during this period, but was not yet as rigid as it would become in later dynasties. Historical records mention both remarriage of widows and celebration of those who remained single in devotion to their deceased husbands' memories. This ambivalence toward remarriage appears in some later versions of the Mulan story, where she refuses marriage offers after her return from war. Within family homes, women typically occupied the inner quarters, while men managed activities in the outer rooms, a physical manifestation of the Neiwei, inner-outer division of responsibilities, advocated in Confucian texts. However, archaeological evidence from common households shows that this strict separation was often impossible in smaller dwellings, where space was limited and practical concerns predominated. The subtle resistance of women to patriarchal constraints appears throughout Chinese history in various forms, from folk songs expressing emotional frustrations to carefully navigated influence through male relatives. The Ballad of Mulan represents perhaps the most dramatic imagery of such resistance. A woman stepping entirely outside prescribed gender boundaries, yet ultimately returning to affirm traditional family values. This paradoxical quality has contributed to the tale's enduring appeal across drastically different historical contexts. The earliest surviving written version of the Mulan story appears in the Ballad of Mulan, Mulan Shi, a folk poem first recorded in the musical records of Old and New Gujin Yuelu compiled during the Northern Song Dynasty, 960–1127 CE. However, textual evidence suggests the ballad had been circulating orally long before, likely originating during the Northern Wei Dynasty, 386–534 CE, or shortly thereafter, circulated across different regions, under the golden canopy of stars that watched over the Xianbei warriors and Han Chinese settlers alike. Stories flowed like water, carrying the weight of tradition and the hope of understanding across cultural divides. The cultural landscape of the Northern Wei period was a tapestry woven with threads of many origins, much like the story of Mulan itself. As nomadic traditions merged with settled agricultural practices, the resulting society produced unique expressions of art, literature, and daily life. It is within this rich cultural milieu that we must understand both the historical reality and the enduring power of Mulan's tale. To truly understand the revolutionary nature of Mulan's legend, we must first comprehend the position of women in Northern Wei society. Unlike the later Tang or Song Dynasty portrayals that would shape modern perceptions of Chinese womanhood, the Northern Wei period presented a more complex picture, especially at the intersection of Xianbei and Han traditions. In the early years of the Northern Wei, when Xianbei cultural elements remained dominant, women maintained certain freedoms unknown to their Han counterparts. The nomadic origins of the Xianbei had necessitated that women play vital roles in the survival of their communities. While men might be absent for long periods during hunting or warfare, women managed households, made important decisions, and sometimes even participated in military training. Historical records describe Xianbei women as skilled riders who could hunt and, when necessary, fight alongside their male counterparts. The Wei Shu, History of Wei, contains accounts of female members of the royal clan who were accomplished archers and horsewomen. This tradition, while gradually diminishing under increasing Sinicization, would have been within living memory during the period when the Mulan ballad likely originated. As the Northern Wei dynasty progressed, however, Han Chinese cultural norms regarding women became increasingly influential among the ruling elite. The Empress Dowager Feng, 442–490 CE, herself of Han ethnicity, actively promoted Confucian values that emphasized female submission and domesticity. This cultural shift coincided with the dynasty's move of its capital from Pingcheng, modern Datong, to Luoyang in 494 CE, a symbolic embrace of Han cultural traditions. In the frontier regions where the Ballad of Mulan likely originated, women's experiences would have existed in a space between these two traditions. Archaeological discoveries from Northern Wei tombs reveal this cultural duality. Women's grave goods often included both traditional Han items, like bronze mirrors and combs, alongside nomadic artifacts such as saddles and weapons. The historical record preserves accounts of several notable women who exercised unusual agency during this period. The aforementioned Empress Dowager Feng, despite promoting Confucian values for others, wielded tremendous political power herself. Born to a Han family, but married into the Xianbei royal house, she effectively ruled the Northern Wei for nearly 3 decades through regencies for her son and grandson, implementing major reforms and directing military campaigns. Buddhist cave inscriptions from Yungang and Longmen also record female donors from various social classes who commissioned religious artwork, demonstrating both spiritual devotion and economic independence. One Northern Wei stele mentions a woman named Liu Jingyan, who sold her hairpins and earrings to finance the creation of a Buddha statue, making significant decisions about family resources. It was in this complex milieu, where traditional steppe freedoms were gradually giving way to Confucian restrictions, but had not yet been entirely supplanted, that the character of Mulan would have been most resonant. Her tale bridges these two worlds: the nomadic tradition, where women could be warriors, and the Confucian tradition, where filial devotion was paramount. While modern retellings often emphasize Mulan's bravery and military prowess, the original ballad centers on her filial devotion. Composed during a time when the Northern Wei court was actively promoting Confucian values, the poem presents Mulan's cross-dressing and military service not as an act of personal fulfillment or feminist resistance, but as an ultimate expression of filial piety, a daughter sacrificing for her father. This moral framing would have made the tale acceptable within Confucian norms, even as its heroine performed deeds that transgressed gender boundaries. Mulan does not challenge the existing social order. Rather, her extraordinary actions are portrayed as necessary to fulfill her obligations within that order. She does not seek to remain in the male sphere, but returns to her proper female role once her filial duty is complete. Archaeological evidence from the period reveals the growing emphasis on Confucian family structures. Tomb paintings and figurines increasingly depicted women in domestic settings, while funerary inscriptions praised female deceased for their chastity, obedience, and household management skills. By the late Northern Wei period, elite families were arranging marriages for daughters at increasingly young ages and restricting female education to domestic arts and moral texts. Yet this transition was incomplete and uneven. In frontier regions, and among common people, practical needs often outweighed ideological prescriptions. Farmers' wives and daughters worked in fields, merchant women managed shops, and artisans' female relatives participated in family trades. The archaeological record shows women's tools alongside men's in many household contexts, suggesting shared or overlapping work spheres. It is worth noting that the Mulan ballad specifies that she had no elder brother to serve in her father's place. In the Northern Wei military conscription system, families with multiple adult males were expected to provide soldiers while maintaining their agricultural production. A family with only one adult male faced potential ruin if that man were conscripted. In such circumstances, historical records confirm that other family members, including wives, daughters, and elderly parents, had to assume traditionally male responsibilities. The opening lines of the Mulan ballad find her at her loom, a quintessentially female occupation that contrasts sharply with the military role she will soon assume. This juxtaposition is not merely dramatic, it reflects the economic reality of women's lives in the Northern Wei period. Textile production was essential to both agricultural and nomadic communities. Archaeological remains from Northern Wei sites have yielded spindle whorls, loom weights, and bone needles in abundance, testifying to the centrality of textile work. Elite women supervised household textile production, while common women spent countless hours spinning, weaving, and sewing, creating both everyday garments and valuable trade goods. The sound of the loom that opens the ballad would have been the soundtrack of female existence, a constant rhythmic presence in household courtyards and women's quarters. Fragments of Northern Wei textiles that have survived in tombs and desert sites reveal sophisticated techniques, complex weaves, delicate embroidery, and resourceful use of materials ranging from silk and hemp to wool and ramie. In the ballad, Mulan's transition from loom to warhorse symbolizes her movement between gendered spheres. Significantly, when she returns home at the poem's end, she reverts not just to female dress, but to female occupation, once again sitting before her loom. The circular structure reinforces the message that her military service was an extraordinary interlude, not a permanent transgression of gender boundaries. Yet even this seemingly conservative framing contains subversive elements. By demonstrating competence in both realms, the feminine domestic sphere and the masculine military sphere, Mulan implicitly challenges the notion that gender roles reflect natural abilities rather than social convention. Her success as a soldier suggests that the boundaries between men's and women's work are permeable, even as the narrative ultimately reinforces them. The geopolitical reality that forms the backdrop of Mulan's story deserves careful attention. The northern frontier of the Northern Wei was not merely a line on a map, but a complex zone of interaction, conflict, and cultural exchange. Understanding this landscape helps illuminate both the historical circumstances of the period and the enduring power of Mulan's legend. The Great Wall, often imagined as a single, continuous structure, was during the Northern Wei period actually a series of earthen ramparts, watchtowers, and garrison towns stretching across the northern territories. These defenses marked not so much a strict border as a strategic depth of frontier, a zone where imperial authority gradually faded and different cultural systems overlapped. Archaeological surveys of Northern Wei border installations reveal a practical approach to frontier defense. Rather than attempting to seal the border completely, an impossible task given the vast distances involved, Wei rulers established military agricultural colonies, Tuntian, where soldier farmers cultivated land and maintained defensive readiness. These colonies created buffer zones that absorbed minor raids while providing early warning of major invasions. At strategic points along the frontier, the Northern Wei constructed fortress towns that served as regional administrative centers, military bases and trading hubs. Archaeological excavations at sites like Wu Wei, Zhangye, and Dunhuang have uncovered the remnants of these settlements. Grid-patterned streets, defensive walls with watchtowers, government buildings, temples, and markets. Life in these frontier towns represented a fusion of cultures. Han Chinese administrators worked alongside Xianbei military commanders. Markets featured goods from the steppe alongside products from the agricultural heartland. Buddhist monks from Central Asia established temples next to shrines, honoring traditional Chinese and nomadic deities. The material culture recovered from these sites tells a story of adaptation and innovation. Pottery combines Chinese glazing techniques with nomadic decorative motifs. Household inventories include both sophisticated bronze mirrors of Chinese manufacture and practical felt goods of steppe origin. Clothing depicted in murals and figurines shows a blend of styles, the flowing robes of the Han tradition alongside the practical fitted garments of the horsemen. It was in this frontier context where cultures met and merged, where pragmatism often outweighed tradition, that Mulan's story would have emerged. The frontier's unique social ecology created spaces where exceptional circumstances might require exceptional gender arrangements, making her tale both extraordinary and plausible. The ballad identifies Mulan's opponents as the Rouran, also transcribed as Huan or Zhujian, a confederation of nomadic peoples who dominated the Mongolian steppe from the late 4th to the mid-6th century CE. Understanding this historical enemy adds depth to the military context of Mulan's service. Chinese historical texts describe the Rouran in unflattering terms, depicting them as fierce warriors who threatened settled peoples through raids and demands for tribute. The Weishu records decades of conflict between the Northern Wei and the Rouran, with fortunes ebbing and flowing on both sides. Major campaigns occurred during the reigns of Emperor Taiwu, R424-452 CE, and Emperor Xiaowen, R471-499 CE, periods that align with possible dates for the Mulan ballad's composition. Archaeological evidence provides a more nuanced view of Rouran society than the Chinese texts. Burial sites in Mongolia and southern Siberia reveal a people with sophisticated metalworking skills, particularly in gold and silver ornaments. Their material culture shows influences from multiple sources, including China, Sogdiana, and the earlier Xiongnu Confederation, suggesting extensive trade networks. The Rouran practiced a mixed economy combining pastoral nomadism with limited agriculture in favorable areas. Their political organization featured a Kagan, supreme ruler, at the apex of a clan-based hierarchy. While primarily nomadic, they established semi-permanent headquarters where the Kagan held court, received emissaries, and coordinated military campaigns. Warfare between the Northern Wei and the Rouran typically featured swift cavalry actions rather than prolonged sieges or set-piece battles. Rouran forces excelled at mobility, using compound bows from horseback with devastating effect. Wei commanders responded with their own mounted troops, many of Xianbei origin, while relying on fortifications and numerical superiority when battles moved to settled terrain. This historical context helps explain certain elements of the Mulan Ballad. The emphasis on horsemanship and cavalry equipment reflects the actual military requirements of frontier warfare. The lengthy campaign described in the poem, lasting 10 or 12 years, aligns with historical records of protracted conflicts between the Wei and Rouran, punctuated by periods of raiding and counter-raiding, rather than continuous large-scale engagement. While the Mulan Ballad does not specify its precise setting, geographical clues point to the Yellow River Valley in what is now northern Shaanxi and southern Inner Mongolia. This region, which represented the northern frontier of agricultural settlement during the Northern Wei period, has a landscape that matches the poetic description. Archaeological work in this region has uncovered extensive Northern Wei remains, including frontier fortifications, military colonies, and civilian settlements. Environmental studies reveal that during the 5th–6th centuries CE, this area enjoyed a slightly warmer and wetter climate than at present, supporting more extensive agriculture and denser population. The Yellow River itself is described in the Ballad, with Mulan camping on its banks, a geographically accurate detail, as the river formed a natural boundary and military highway in the region. The reference to the Black Mountains, likely the Yin Mountains of Inner Mongolia, similarly places the action in this frontier zone where the agricultural lands of China met the grasslands of the steppe. This geographical setting is significant for understanding the social context of the legend. As a transitional zone between different ecological regions, farmland and pasture, settled and nomadic, it was precisely the sort of area where cultural boundaries might be most permeable. Here, pragmatic adaptations to challenging circumstances could override strict ideological dictates, creating space for exceptional individuals like the legendary Mulan. Like all enduring legends, Mulan's story did not remain static, but evolved, as it passed through different historical periods and artistic treatments. Tracing this evolution reveals much about changing Chinese attitudes toward gender, loyalty, ethnicity, and heroism. The original Ballad of Mulan, Mulan Si, first appears in written form in the Music Bureau collection, Yuefu Shiji, compiled during the 12th century. However, internal evidence and linguistic features suggest it originated much earlier, likely during the Northern Wei or early Tang period, 5th, 7th centuries CE. The ballad's simple, direct language and folk meter point to origins in oral tradition, rather than literary composition. In its earliest form, the ballad is remarkably brief, just a few hundred characters that sketch Mulan's story in spare, evocative language. It concentrates on key dramatic moments: her decision to take her father's place, her years of service without discovery, and her return to female dress after the campaign. Notably, the early version contains no romantic elements, no battle descriptions, and ends with Mulan's simple return to domestic life. During the Tang Dynasty, 618–907 CE, as the ballad gained literary recognition, poets and scholars began elaborating on Mulan's story. The Tang era, known for relatively liberal attitudes toward women and appreciation of martial virtues, found much to admire in Mulan's tale. Tang versions added details about her military accomplishments and emphasized her loyalty to the emperor, alongside her filial piety. The poet Du Mu, 803–852 CE, wrote a famous quatrain titled Mulan that focuses on her return home and resumption of feminine appearance, an elegant distillation of the gender themes in the original ballad. Another Tang poet, Wei Yuanfu, composed Song of Mulan, emphasizing her martial prowess and comparing her to historical military heroes. Archaeological discoveries from the Tang period include pottery figurines depicting female warriors that may have been influenced by the Mulan legend. These figurines show women in military dress riding horses or wielding weapons, a unique artistic category that blends gender transgression with artistic appreciation. During this period, the legend began spreading beyond the written text through performance traditions. Tang and Song Dynasty records mention storytellers and ballad singers who performed extended versions of Mulan's tale in marketplaces and tea houses. These oral performances likely added dramatic elements and local color not found in the original spare narrative. The Song Dynasty, 960–1279 CE, saw significant changes in Chinese gender norms, with Neo-Confucian philosophers promoting stricter separation between male and female spheres. In this context, Mulan's story was increasingly interpreted as an extraordinary exception that proved the rule of proper gender roles rather than a challenge to them. Song Dynasty writers emphasized that Mulan maintained her chastity throughout her military service and returned willingly to women's quarters afterward. The theme of disguise became more prominent, with elaborate descriptions of how she concealed her feminine nature. Some versions added a female companion who helps Mulan maintain her secret, an innovation that simultaneously acknowledged female solidarity and reinforced the difficulty of crossing gender boundaries. During the Yuan Dynasty, 1279–1368 CE, when China was ruled by Mongol conquerors, Mulan's story gained new relevance as an example of Chinese loyalty and resistance. The playwright Xianbei, 1521–1593 CE, composed the drama Female Mulan Joins the Army in Place of Her Father, Qi Mulan, Tifu Kongjun, which became a staple of Chinese theatre. In this version, Mulan's ethnic identity is clearly Chinese, while her enemies are portrayed as northern barbarians, a significant departure from the original context. Xianbei's play added dramatic elements that would become standard in later retellings. A scene where Mulan narrowly avoids discovery while bathing, a male comrade who unknowingly falls in love with her, and an imperial marriage proposal that she respectfully declines to return home. These additions heightened the dramatic tension around her gender disguise while maintaining her moral virtue. The Ming Dynasty, 1368–1644 CE, produced the first full-length novel centered on Mulan, Romance of Sui and Tang, Sui Tang Yanyi, which placed her story in the Sui-Tang transition period, centuries after its likely original setting. This version added supernatural elements, depicting Mulan as not merely a skilled warrior, but a martial arts master with almost magical abilities. Significantly, the Ming novel gave Mulan a surname, Hua, not present in earlier versions. This name, which literally means flower, plays on the homophone for China, Huaxia, reinforcing her symbolic role as defender of Chinese civilization. The novel also expanded her family background, giving her a mother, sister, and younger brother absent from the original ballad. During the Qing Dynasty, 1644–1912 CE, when China was ruled by the Manchu ethnic group from beyond the Great Wall, Mulan's story again acquired layers of meaning related to ethnicity and loyalty. Some Qing versions portrayed her as ethnically Han, serving a non-Han dynasty, a parallel to Han Chinese serving under Manchu rule. These retellings emphasized loyalty to legitimate authority, regardless of ethnic origin. The Qing period also saw Mulan's story incorporated into regional folk traditions. In Henan province, temples were dedicated to her as a local deity. Annual performances celebrated her as a cultural heroine, with local details added to root her story in specific geography. These regional adaptations claimed Mulan as their own, situating her birthplace in their territories and incorporating local landmarks into her legend. Archaeological evidence from the Ming and Qing periods includes woodblock illustrations of Mulan's story used in printed books, showing her in various scenes from the expanded narrative. These illustrations typically depicted her in male military dress but with slightly feminine facial features, a visual compromise that acknowledged both her disguise and her true gender. The early 20th century brought radical changes to Chinese society and new interpretations of Mulan's legend. Republican-era scholars, 1912-1949, analyzed the ballad as literature rather than moral instruction, debating its origins, authorship, and historical context. Some feminist writers claimed Mulan as a proto-feminist heroine whose story demonstrated women's equal capabilities. During the Communist era, 1949-present, official interpretations emphasized Mulan's humble origins and service to her country rather than her filial piety or feminine virtues. Cultural productions from this period, including the famous 1963 movie Mulan Joins the Army, portrayed her as a people's hero fighting against class oppression and foreign invasion, themes that resonated with communist ideology. The legends' global spread began in earnest with translations into European languages in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Early Western sinologists, like Herbert Giles, included the Mulan Ballad in their collections of Chinese literature, introducing her story to English-speaking audiences. These translations often emphasized the exotic and unusual aspects of the tale rather than its cultural context. The most significant modern transformation came with Disney's 1998 animated film Mulan, which introduced the legend to global audiences, but substantially altered its themes and details. The Disney version emphasized individual self-discovery and romantic love, themes largely absent from traditional Chinese versions. This adaptation, while criticized for its cultural inaccuracies, nonetheless brought renewed attention to the ancient legend. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to provide context for understanding the historical background of Mulan's legend. Excavations of Northern Wei tombs have yielded artifacts that illuminate the material culture referenced in the ballad: weapons, armor, household items, and textiles, similar to those Mulan would have used. These findings, while not proving the legend's historicity, help situate it within a concrete historical environment. As the quieter tones of evening calm the restless mind, the story of Mulan continues to flow across time like the Yellow River itself. Each age finds in her tale reflections of its own concerns and aspirations, layers of meaning accumulating like silt on the riverbed. The young woman who once sat at her loom, hearing the call to duty that would transform her life, now sits in the collective imagination of cultures around the world, her journey still unfolding across to maintain discipline and ensure their own safety. Despite the hardships, Mulan found solace in the night sky, remembering her father's teachings about the constellations as she lay beneath the same stars that watched over her family back home. The Northern Wei army was a diverse collection of ethnic backgrounds: Han Chinese who had assimilated into Wei culture, Xianbei tribespeople, and other nomadic warriors from across the steppelands. This diversity would have exposed Mulan to languages, customs, and fighting techniques far different from what she had known in her village. As the seasons changed, Mulan's unit marched northward, engaging in smaller skirmishes against rebel factions and Rouran raiding parties. Through these encounters, she would have learned the true nature of warfare, not the glorious combat of poetry, but a grim business of survival, quick violence, and long periods of waiting. The reality of killing another human being would have been a profound transformation for a young person raised in a Confucian household, where harmony and filial piety were the highest virtues. In the ballad, 12 years pass in mere sentences. For Mulan, these would have been formative years of her life, spent not in marriage and childbearing as would have been expected of a woman of her age, but in the harsh company of men at war. She would have seen comrades fall in battle, villages burned, and experienced the brutal winters of the northern steppe, where temperatures fell so low that metal would stick to bare skin. The army's diet would have been sparse: dried meat, millet porridge, and whatever could be foraged or hunted along the way. The early Tang Dynasty poet Du Fu, who wrote of war and its consequences with searing honesty, captured something of what Mulan might have experienced in his poem, the army wagons. Men die in the field, fighting over the spoils, the horses of the conquered neigh at heaven. This stark reality of conflict would have been Mulan's daily existence during her service. To understand the world in which Mulan served, we must step back and examine the Northern Wei dynasty more closely. Founded by the Tuoba clan of the Xianbei people, the Northern Wei unified northern China after the chaotic 16 Kingdoms period. The dynasty represented a fascinating blend of nomadic steppe culture and traditional Chinese governance, creating a hybrid society that would ultimately influence the reunification of China. Emperor Taiwu, 408–452 CE, one of the greatest northern Wei rulers, expanded the empire's boundaries through military campaigns against the Rouran Khaganate and other rivals. He was known for his martial prowess, but also for his policies of Sinicization, adopting Chinese customs, bureaucratic structures, and cultural elements. This process accelerated under Emperor Xiaowen, 467–499 CE, who implemented sweeping reforms to transform the Xianbei aristocracy into a more Chinese-style court. Among Xiaowen's most significant reforms was the moving of the capital from Pingcheng, modern-day Datong, to Luoyang in 494 CE, symbolically placing the Northern Wei seat of power in one of ancient China's most historically significant cities. He also mandated that the Xianbei elite adopt Chinese surnames, clothing, and language. Court ceremonies followed Chinese rituals, and Confucian classics became required study for officials. The army in which Mulan would have served reflected this cultural duality. While organized according to Chinese military principles with infantry, cavalry, and archery divisions, it retained the fierce mounted warfare tactics that made steppe armies so formidable. Northern Wei soldiers wore lamella armor made of overlapping leather or metal plates laced together, providing flexibility and protection. Their primary weapons included the composite bow, a powerfully engineered weapon made of layers of wood, sinew, and horn, as well as the straight sword, spear, and for cavalry, the long lance. Religious life in the Northern Wei period was equally complex. Buddhism flourished under imperial patronage, with the magnificent Yungan grottos near Pingcheng and the Longmen grottos near Luoyang standing as enduring monuments to Buddhist faith. These cave temples, carved from solid rock and filled with thousands of Buddha statues and inscriptions, represent some of the finest Buddhist art ever created. Emperor Xiaowen was particularly devoted to Buddhism, even taking the unusual step of personally lecturing on Buddhist sutras. Simultaneously, traditional Chinese religious practices continued, including ancestral worship and ceremonies honoring heaven and earth. Taoism maintained its influence, particularly among the common people, offering an alternative philosophical and spiritual path focused on harmony with nature and the pursuit of longevity. For many soldiers like Mulan, folk beliefs would have provided comfort in times of danger, with amulets and prayers to various deities for protection in battle. The Northern Wei legal system combined elements of both steppe tribal customs and Chinese legal traditions. Law codes emphasize collective responsibility, with families and communities held accountable for the actions of individuals. Punishment could be harsh, ranging from caning to exile or execution, though Buddhist influence gradually moderated some of the more severe penalties. For women in Northern Wei society, the picture was complex. Traditional Chinese Confucian values increasingly relegated women to domestic roles, yet Xianbei cultural traditions granted women somewhat more freedom. Xianbei women historically rode horses, participated in hunts, and were not subjected to practices like foot binding that would later severely restrict Chinese women's mobility. This cultural intersection may explain how the Mulan story of a woman taking on a male role could resonate in this period, representing both the traditional filial piety of Chinese culture and the greater flexibility of gender roles in steppe societies. Agriculture formed the economic foundation of the Northern Wei state, with the equal field system, Juntianjidu, distributing land to peasant households based on the number of able-bodied members. In return, peasants paid taxes in grain and cloth and provided labor service. This system aimed to prevent the concentration of land ownership among the elite while ensuring state revenues. Markets flourished in cities like Luoyang and Pingcheng, where goods from across Asia, including silk from the south, horses from the west, jade from Khotan, and spices from distant lands, changed hands. The arts under Northern Wei patronage reflected the dynasty's unique cultural synthesis. Court painters combined Chinese brush techniques with Central Asian color sensibilities. Poetry followed Chinese metrical patterns, but often featured themes of nomadic life and martial valor. Music incorporated new instruments and melodies from the Western regions. Buddhist sculpture showcased a distinctive style with elongated figures, flowing robes, and serene expressions that would influence East Asian religious art for centuries. Against this backdrop of cultural transformation, the Northern Wei military campaigns continued. The primary adversaries during this period were the Rouran Khaganate to the north, fierce nomadic warriors from whom the Northern Wei themselves had once fled, and the series of southern dynasties that controlled the lands below the Yangtze River. The border between north and south was never entirely peaceful, with periodic incursions and counterattacks along the frontier zones. For a soldier like Mulan, daily life would have been dictated by military necessity and the harsh realities of campaign life. The Northern Wei maintained frontier garrisons along its borders, with soldiers serving tours of duty that typically lasted several years. Military colonies, Tuntian, combined defense with agriculture, with soldiers expected to grow crops when not training or fighting. This system helped sustain the military while establishing controlled settlements in conquered territories. The Ballad of Mulan makes reference to the sound of Yan mountains clashing and military expeditions to the Black River, placing her service in the northern frontier regions where the Northern Wei confronted their nomadic rivals. The historical record shows that during the late 5th century, the Northern Wei conducted several major campaigns against the Rouran Khaganate, which may provide the historical context for Mulan's military service. The Rouran were formidable adversaries, who had created a powerful confederation of nomadic tribes across what is now Mongolia and parts of Siberia. Their leaders bore the title Khan, signifying their supreme authority. Mounted on hardy steppe ponies and skilled in the art of the composite bow, which could be fired with deadly accuracy from horseback, they posed a constant threat to settled agricultural civilizations along their borders. Under the leadership of Khagans like Ujiulu Shelun, R402-410, and Ujiulu Datan, R414-429, the Rouran had established a complex relationship with the Northern Wei that alternated between open warfare and uneasy diplomatic relations secured through marriage alliances. The pattern was familiar across Chinese history. When the imperial court was strong, it would launch punitive expeditions against nomadic peoples. When weak, it would sue for peace through treaties and trade agreements. A soldier in the Northern Wei army, Mulan would have been part of campaigns that typically began in spring, when the steppe grasses were sufficient to sustain the army's horses. The logistics of moving thousands of troops across the harsh terrain of northern China and the Mongolian plateau were daunting. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, vulnerable to weather and enemy raids. Each soldier carried dried rations, millet cakes, jerky, and dried fruit, but foraging and hunting supplemented these provisions. Military tactics employed by the Northern Wei combined traditional Chinese approaches with steppe warfare techniques. Units were organized decimally, in groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Heavy infantry formed the core of defensive formations, while cavalry provided mobility and striking power. Archery remained fundamental to both defensive and offensive operations. Engineers constructed siege equipment when needed for assaulting enemy fortifications. Battle itself was a chaotic, terrifying experience. The din of war drums, the thunder of hooves, the screams of the wounded, and the whistle of arrows would have created a cacophony that tested even the bravest hearts. Formation integrity was crucial. Soldiers were trained to maintain their positions even as comrades fell around them. For Mulan, preserving her disguise amid such chaos would have required extraordinary discipline and presence of mind. One significant campaign occurred around 490 CE, when Northern Wei forces pushed deep into Rouran territory after a series of border raids had threatened imperial security. The campaign involved crossing the Gobi Desert, a perilous journey where water sources were scarce and temperatures fluctuated wildly between scorching days and freezing nights. Soldiers carried water in animal skin bags and rationed it carefully. Dust storms could arise without warning, blinding troops and separating units from the main force. The Northern Wei strategy typically involved rapid cavalry movements to locate and engage Rouran forces before they could disperse into the vastness of the steppe. When the nomadic warriors employed their favorite tactic, the feigned retreat designed to break enemy formations, Wei commanders countered with disciplined pursuit forces supported by reserve units ready to respond to sudden counterattacks. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the weapons and armor Mulan would have used. Iron swords with ring pommels, designed for both cutting and thrusting, were standard issue for infantry. Cavalry often wielded longer lances for charging and shorter blades for close combat after the initial engagement. Armor consisted of lamellar plates of iron or hardened leather laced together to form a flexible protective covering. Helmets were typically iron with neck and ear protectors. For a woman maintaining a male disguise, certain aspects of military life would have posed particular challenges. Privacy was nearly non-existent in army camps. Soldiers bathed in groups when water was available, relieved themselves in communal latrines, and slept in close quarters within tents or temporary barracks. Medieval Chinese accounts of women disguised as men in various contexts suggest techniques that might have been employed. Bathing at night or separately under the pretense of religious purity observances, binding breasts tightly with cloth, strips, and adopting masculine speech patterns and mannerisms. Historical records from the period describe the hardships of northern campaigns. The 6th century Book of Wei, Wei Shu, notes that during one expedition, of every 10 men who marched north, only 3 or 4 returned. Disease claimed as many lives as enemy weapons. Dysentery, typhoid, and respiratory infections spread rapidly through crowded camps. Frostbite in winter and heat exhaustion in summer disabled countless soldiers. Medical knowledge, though sophisticated, by medieval standards, could do little for many battlefield injuries. Yet amid these hardships, soldiers formed bonds of brotherhood that transcended background and origin. The shared experience of facing death together created loyalty that often surpassed family ties. In the Records of the Three Kingdoms, the scholar Chen Shou wrote that men who have shared the same boiler's steam become closer than brothers, a sentiment that would have applied equally to Mulan's time. These relationships would have been both Mulan's greatest support and her greatest vulnerability. The closer her comrades came to her, the greater the risk of discovery. The Ballad tells us that Mulan served for 12 years of campaigns, suggesting multiple expeditions rather than a single extended deployment. Between campaigns, the army would have returned to garrison duties along the northern frontier or to the capital for re-equipping and training new recruits. These periods of relative calm would have offered their own rhythm: drilling, maintaining weapons and armor, and the mundane tasks of military life interspersed with moments of camaraderie around evening fires. Historical sources suggest that Northern Wei military campaigns against the Rouran achieved varying degrees of success. Some expeditions secured temporary submission and tribute from nomadic leaders, while others ended in strategic withdrawal when supply lines became overstretched or weather conditions deteriorated. The nature of steppe warfare made decisive victory elusive. Nomadic forces could always retreat deeper into the vastness of the Mongolian plateau, dispersing until imperial armies were forced to return to their bases. One particularly significant confrontation occurred around 429 CE, when Northern Wei forces defeated the Rouran at the Battle of Wupetai, killing their Khagan Datan. The victory temporarily secured the northern borders and demonstrated the growing military prowess of the Northern Wei state. Later campaigns under Emperor Xiaowen aimed not just at defeating the Rouran, but at establishing a more permanent buffer zone of military colonies and fortifications along the frontier. Beyond the physical challenges of campaign life and the constant vigilance required to maintain her disguise, Mulan would have undergone a profound psychological transformation during her years of service. The young woman who left home to save her father would have been irrevocably changed by her experiences of war, camaraderie, and the complex moral landscape of military service. Chinese philosophical traditions offer insights into how Mulan might have understood her own journey. The Confucian concept of li, ritual propriety, would have been in constant tension with her deception, even though her motivation, filial piety, was the highest Confucian virtue. Taoism, with its emphasis on the balance of yin and yang forces and the value of adaptability, might have provided a framework for integrating her seemingly contradictory identities as both woman and soldier. Buddhist teachings, which had spread widely through China by the Northern Wei period, would have offered another perspective. The concept of emptiness, shunyata, suggests that all phenomena, including gender identities, lack inherent existence and are conditionally created. For a philosophically inclined Mulan, Buddhist thought might have provided a way to understand her fluid movement between social roles as demonstrating the ultimately constructed nature of those roles. Contemporary gender theory gives us additional tools for thinking about Mulan's experience. Rather than seeing her as simply a woman pretending to be a man, we might understand her as embodying what anthropologists call liminality, existing in the threshold between established categories. In this liminal space, she would have gained unique insights into the constructed nature of gender roles in her society, observing how masculinity was performed and reinforced through daily rituals and behaviors. The psychological burden of maintaining a false identity for years would have been enormous. Modern studies of individuals living undercover or with concealed identities suggest patterns of hypervigilance, compartmentalization, and the development of highly adaptive social skills. Mulan would have learned to read subtle social cues, anticipate questions that might expose her, and develop consistent backstories to explain any behaviors that might seem unusual. At the same time, the military environment would have shaped her in ways common to soldiers across time and culture. Combat experiences would have triggered neurological and psychological changes. Heightened alertness, emotional regulation in crisis situations, and possibly traumatic stress responses to witnessed horrors. The medieval Chinese had no formal concept of post-traumatic stress, but they recognized the transformative impact of warfare on the human spirit. The Tang Dynasty poet Du Fu wrote of returning veterans. Hair white as silk threads, they lean on village gates, tears falling. Leadership, responsibilities would have developed different aspects of Mulan's character. While the ballad is vague about her rank, her demonstrated competence would likely have led to increased responsibilities over her years of service. Chinese military treatises, like The Art of War, emphasize qualities of effective leadership, clarity of purpose, moral authority, disciplined compassion, and strategic thinking. As Mulan gained experience, she would have had opportunities to develop these qualities within herself. The tension between violence and virtue would have presented one of the most profound psychological challenges. Confucian thought valued harmony and benevolence, yet military service required acts of violence that stood in apparent contradiction to these ideals. The philosophical tradition of righteous warfare, Yizhan, offered one reconciliation, suggesting that conflict undertaken to restore order and protect the innocent could be morally justified. Still, the direct experience of taking human life would have forced a deeper, more personal reckoning with these philosophical abstractions. Isolation, despite being surrounded by comrades, would have been another psychological reality. The gap between her external presentation and inner experience would have created a fundamental loneliness that few historical figures have navigated for so long. This isolation might have been periodically relieved through correspondence with family. Letter writing was well established in medieval China, with courier systems connecting major cities and military outposts. Even so, the inability to fully share her experience with anyone would have created a profound solitude. Yet amid these challenges, Mulan would have discovered unexpected strengths and insights. The liminal space she occupied between defined social Roles might have granted her a unique perspective on her society's gender constructions. By successfully performing masculinity while retaining her feminine self-understanding, she embodied the Taoist principle that apparent opposites contain elements of each other, the yin within yang, the yang within yin. Her ability to adapt and thrive in circumstances far removed from her expected life path demonstrates what modern psychologists call resilience, the capacity to maintain core identity and purpose while adapting to radically changed circumstances. This resilience would have been nurtured by her clear sense of purpose, protecting her father, her practical competence in military skills, and perhaps by spiritual practices common among soldiers of the time. These might have included meditative techniques derived from Taoist or Buddhist traditions, focusing on breath control and mental clarity. The Song Dynasty military encyclopedia, Wujing Zongyao, describes techniques for maintaining calm in battle that combine practical advice with spiritual elements. Before engaging the enemy, the wise general calms his mind like still water, breathing deeply and seeing clearly without emotion clouding his judgment. As years passed, Mulan's initial motivation, taking her father's place, would likely have been supplemented by additional layers of purpose. Loyalty to her comrades, commitment to their shared mission, and perhaps even patriotic sentiment toward the Northern Wei state would have developed alongside her filial devotion. This evolution of purpose reflects a universal pattern in military service across cultures and time periods. The end of her service, when it finally came, would have presented its own psychological challenges. Modern veterans often struggle with the transition to civilian life after extended military service, and Mulan would have faced similar adjustments. The hypervigilance necessary for both combat survival and maintaining her disguise would have been difficult to relinquish. The structured environment of military life, with its clear hierarchies and defined purposes, would give way to the more ambiguous demands of civilian existence. Moreover, she would have returned with experiences that set her apart from those who remained at home, creating what some scholars call a narrative gap, the inability to fully communicate transformative experiences to those who have not shared them. This gap often leads to a sense of alienation among returning veterans, a feeling that might have been particularly acute for Mulan, given the additional layer of secrecy surrounding her service. The Ballad of Mulan describes a pivotal moment near the end of her service, recognition by the emperor himself. According to the poem, after years of distinguished service, she and her comrades were summoned to the imperial palace. The emperor wished to bestow honors and rewards upon those who had served with particular valor. It was a moment of triumph, yet for Mulan, it contained the seeds of potential exposure. The imperial court of the Northern Wei would have been an environment radically different from the battlefield. By the late 5th century, especially after Emperor Xiaowen's reforms, the court had adopted many of the elaborate ceremonies and protocols of traditional Chinese imperial governance. The physical setting would have been magnificent. Vast halls with red lacquered columns supporting intricate wooden ceilings, walls adorned with paintings and calligraphy, and throne rooms designed to emphasize the cosmic authority of the emperor. Court protocols were precisely defined. Visitors approached the emperor with a series of bows and prostrations, speaking only when addressed, and using specialized vocabulary reserved for imperial communication. Officials wore distinct robes indicating their rank and function, with colors, patterns, and accessories strictly regulated by sumptuary laws. For soldiers accustomed to the relative informality of campaign life, these protocols would have been intimidating and foreign. The emperor himself was a figure of almost supernatural significance in Chinese political theology. The concept of the mandate of heaven, Qianming, positioned the emperor as the intermediary between cosmic forces and human society, responsible for maintaining harmony between heaven and earth through proper ritual and virtuous governance. When addressing such a figure, even seasoned warriors might find themselves trembling. Imperial rewards for military service took various forms in medieval China. Land grants were common, providing veterans with the means to support themselves after service. Promotions in rank, both military and civil, acknowledged exceptional service and opened paths to political influence. Material rewards included gold, silver, fine silks, and ceremonial weapons. Perhaps most valued were hereditary titles that elevated not just the individual, but their entire lineage. In the Ballad, the emperor offers Mulan an official position at court. This reflected a common practice of incorporating successful military leaders into the administrative apparatus of the state. The Chinese tradition of the scholar official ideal meant that even in a dynasty with strong martial influences like the Northern Wei, civil governance was considered the higher calling. For a warrior to be offered such a position represented a significant honor and recognition of both martial prowess and leadership qualities. The moment of imperial recognition represented both the pinnacle of Mulan's military career and her moment of greatest vulnerability. Closer scrutiny at court, surrounded by officials trained in observation and political calculation, increased the risk of her disguise being penetrated. The poem suggests that she declined the imperial appointment, asking instead for a swift horse to return home, a request that might have seemed unusual to contemporaries familiar with the prestige of court positions. Historical context helps us understand the significance of her choice. While service to the emperor was considered the highest calling in Confucian political philosophy, there existed a parallel tradition of the virtuous official who retreats from public life rather than serving in corrupt times or when family obligations call. This tradition, exemplified by figures like the Tang Dynasty poet Tao Yuanming, who picked chrysanthemums beneath the eastern fence rather than bow for 5 pecks of rice, accept an official salary, provided cultural precedent for Mulan's decision. The emperor's recognition of Mulan's service without discovering her true identity serves as both a narrative device in the ballad and a profound comment on the nature of merit and gender in medieval Chinese society. That she could serve with such distinction that the emperor himself wished to reward her, yet have her gender remain unremarked, suggests either extraordinary skill in maintaining her disguise or raises the possibility that her comrades and superiors might have known or suspected her secret but valued her service regardless. Some scholarly interpretations suggest that the ballad is deliberately ambiguous on this point, inviting readers to consider that merit might transcend gender categories entirely. The poem emphasizes Mulan's accomplishments rather than the deception itself, suggesting that her story is ultimately about capability and duty rather than transgression of gender boundaries. The historical reality of imperial audiences during the Northern Wei period helps us visualize this crucial scene. Court chronicles describe the throne room at Pingcheng, before the capital moved to Luoyang, as featuring a raised platform where the emperor sat facing south, the direction associated with rulership in Chinese cosmology. Officials and honored guests would be arranged in precise rows according to rank, with court musicians positioned to provide ceremonial accompaniment to the proceedings. Emperor Xiaowen was known for his interest in cultural refinement and his efforts to sinicize the Northern Wei court. Historical accounts describe him as well-versed in Chinese classics and supportive of Confucian scholarship alongside his Buddhist devotion. If Mulan's service occurred during his reign, she would have encountered an emperor who embodied the complex cultural synthesis that characterized the Northern Wei, a ruler of nomadic ancestry who had embraced Chinese traditions while maintaining elements of his Xianbei heritage. The ballad compresses what would likely have been a complex negotiation into a simple exchange. In reality, declining an imperial appointment would have required careful diplomacy to avoid giving offense. Mulan would have needed to frame her request to return home in terms of filial obligation, a value the Confucian court would recognize as legitimate. By emphasizing her duty to care for aging parents, she could transform what might otherwise seem like rejection of imperial favor into an act of virtue. With the emperor's blessing secured and her duty fulfilled, Mulan's military service came to its end. She had survived what few could have imagined possible, years of warfare while maintaining a secret that, if discovered, might have resulted in severe punishment. The ballad suggests she departed the capital with honor intact, and perhaps with material rewards that would benefit her family upon her return. The journey home would have followed the imperial road system, that connected major cities and military outposts across northern China. These roads, some paved with stone and lined with mile markers, facilitated both military movements and commerce. Way stations provided places for travelers to rest and change horses. The better-maintained sections could allow travel of 30-40 miles per day under good conditions. For Mulan, this journey represented a transition between worlds. From the rigidly masculine environment of military service back to the family and village life she had left years before. It would have provided time for reflection and psychological preparation for the challenges of reintegration that awaited her. With each mile that brought her closer to home, she would have begun the process of reclaiming aspects of her identity that had been suppressed during her years of service. Tang poetry continued to flourish throughout the dynasty, with poets like Wang Wei perfecting the landscape poem, capturing the essence of mountains, rivers, and moments of contemplative solitude. In his works, one could feel the meditative quality of Buddhism blending with the natural philosophy of Taoism, creating verses that still resonate with readers over a millennium later. Li Bai's contemporary, Du Fu, often called the poet historian, channeled his concerns about social injustice and the suffering of common people into verses of remarkable compassion and technical brilliance. The culture that produced such poetry was the same that preserved and elaborated on the tale of Mulan. During the Tang Dynasty, the Ballad of Mulan was collected in the anthology Music Bureau Collection, Yuefu Shiji, compiled by Guomao Qian during the Song Dynasty, but containing works from much earlier periods. This preservation marked an important milestone in Mulan's journey from oral tradition to literary canon. While poets wrote of both splendor and sorrow, the Tang dynasty itself faced mounting challenges. The Anlushan Rebellion, 755 and 763 CE, led by a general of Sogdian and Turkic origin, devastated the empire's prosperity and began its slow decline. Though the dynasty would continue for another century and a half, it never fully recovered its former glory. The rebellion resulted in the deaths of millions and forced the Tang court to rely increasingly on regional military governors, diminishing central authority. As Tang power waned, the countryside once again became unstable. Bandit groups formed in remote areas and border troubles renewed. This period of later Tang decline would have resonated with the themes of the Mulan Ballad, of ordinary people stepping forward when central authority faltered, of loyalty being tested in times of instability. The ballad's continued popularity spoke to its universal themes that transcended any single dynasty's rise or fall. After the Tang fell in 907 CE, China entered a period known as the Five Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms, a half-century of division and regional warfare. Then, in 960 CE, the Song dynasty was established, ushering in an era of cultural refinement, artistic achievement, and philosophical innovation that would last until 1279 CE. The Song dynasty represented a different kind of Chinese Golden Age, one focused more on civil administration, artistic developments, and technological innovation than military expansion. This was partly by necessity, as the Song faced powerful neighbors to the north, including the Khitan Liao dynasty and later the Jurchen Jin dynasty, who conquered northern China in 1127, forcing the Song court to flee south. It was during this period that Mulan's story continued to evolve. The Song dynasty oversaw a flourishing of printing technology, allowing tales like Mulan's to be more widely disseminated in written form. The story began to acquire additional details and flourishes as it passed through the hands of Song scholars and storytellers. Crucially, the Song period saw a revival of Confucian thinking, what later scholars would call Neo-Confucianism. This philosophical movement, led by thinkers like Zhu Xi, emphasized moral self-cultivation and proper social relationships. Within this context, Mulan's filial piety, her devotion to her father that motivated her disguise and military service, became increasingly emphasized as the moral center of her story. The Song dynasty also featured greater restrictions on women's roles than the Tang had permitted. Foot binding began during this period, and women's public participation decreased. Against this backdrop, Mulan's cross-dressing adventure took on additional complexity. Her story could be interpreted as both reinforcing Confucian ideals of filial piety while simultaneously presenting a woman stepping outside traditional gender boundaries. Song Dynasty art reached new heights of refinement, with landscape painting particularly flourishing. The delicate brushwork and atmospheric perspective developed by Song painters created vistas of mountains and rivers that seemed to recede into infinite distance. This artistic sensibility influenced how Mulan's tale was visualized, with illustrations from this period showing more detailed landscapes and architectural elements than earlier depictions. By the end of the Song Dynasty, Mulan's tale had become firmly established in the Chinese cultural imagination. No longer just a folk ballad, it had been analyzed by scholars, illustrated by artists, and integrated into the broader literary tradition. The foundation was set for later dynasties to further elaborate on her story. After the Song Dynasty fell, to Mongol invaders who established the Yuan Dynasty, 1279–1368 CE, China experienced foreign rule for nearly a century. The Yuan period saw cultural blending, but also resistance from the Han Chinese population. When the Ming Dynasty, 1368–1644 CE, was established by the rebel leader Zhu Yuanzhang, who became the Hongwu Emperor, it represented a return to Han Chinese rule. The Ming Dynasty brought a cultural flowering and a reconnection with traditional Chinese values. Theatre and performance arts flourished, and it was during this time that Mulan's story underwent perhaps its most significant transformation. The Ming playwright Xu Wei, 1521–1593 CE, composed The Female Mulan Joins the Army, in place of her father, Qi Mulan Tifu Kongjun, a dramatic piece that expanded Mulan's story considerably. Xu Wei's play marked the first time Mulan was given the family name Hua, meaning flower, which would become standard in later tellings. The play elaborated on Mulan's home life before joining the army and added dramatic elements not present in the original ballad. Ming Dynasty theatre often featured elaborate costumes, music, and stylized movements, transforming Mulan's story into a multimedia experience, rather than simply a written or recited tale. The Ming period was also marked by increasing commercialization of culture and a growing reading public. Vernacular fiction became popular, with novels like Journey to the West and Romance of the Three Kingdoms achieving widespread readership. Within this environment, heroic tales like Mulan's found receptive audiences among both elite and common. Ming Dynasty gender ideologies were strongly influenced by Neo-Confucianism, which emphasized strict separation between men and women and female chastity. The philosopher official Zhu Xi's teachings on preserving heavenly principles and eliminating human desires had particular impact on gender roles. Women were increasingly confined to domestic spheres, making Mulan's military adventure all the more exceptional within the Ming context. Yet alongside these restrictive gender norms, the Ming period also saw the emergence of women poets and artists who challenged conventional boundaries. Women like Ye Xiaoluan and Shang Jinglan created works that expressed personal feelings and perspectives rarely voiced in earlier periods. In this complex environment, Mulan's story could be interpreted as both reinforcing filial values while simultaneously presenting a woman who moved beyond conventional limitations. The Ming Dynasty also saw renewed attention to military matters. After expelling the Mongols, the early Ming emperors rebuilt the Great Wall and conducted large military campaigns to secure borders. Military service was once again valorized, providing a favorable context for tales of martial heroism like Mulan's story. Military examinations existed alongside civil ones, although the civil path remained more prestigious for scholarly families. By the late Ming period, Mulan had been transformed from a simple folk heroine into a complex cultural symbol. Her story had absorbed elements reflecting Ming concerns with cultural authenticity, gender propriety, military service, and filial obligations. These elaborations prepared the ground for the final imperial dynasty's further adaptation of her legend. The Qing dynasty, 1644–1912 CE, established when Manchu forces from beyond the Great Wall conquered Ming China, marked China's last imperial era. As ethnic outsiders, The Manchu rulers both enforced certain customs of their own, like the male queue hairstyle, and embraced Chinese cultural traditions to legitimize their rule. This complex cultural politics created a fertile environment for tales that navigated questions of identity, loyalty, and cultural authenticity. During the 17th century, the novelist Chu Renhuo incorporated Mulan's story into his work, Sui Tang Romance, Sui Tang Yanyi, setting her tale specifically during the Tang Dynasty. Though this historical placement had no basis in the original ballad, this novel expanded her story dramatically, giving Mulan a rich backstory and complex motivations. For the first time, Mulan was portrayed as a martial arts expert before joining the army, trained by her father in preparation for her military service. The Qing period also saw the composition of Mulan Joins the Army, a play in the Peking opera tradition. Peking opera, with its elaborate costumes, stylized movements, and distinct musical patterns, brought Mulan's story to life through performances across China. The visual iconography developed during this period, Mulan's transformation from civilian women's clothes to military attire, became enduring symbols of her story. During the long peace of the High Qing period, roughly 1680–1800, vernacular literature flourished, and stories like Mulan's reached wider audiences than ever before. Increased literacy, especially in urban areas, meant that tales once transmitted primarily through oral tradition now circulated in multiple written forms. Woodblock printing made illustrated versions of stories affordable for middle-class households. The Qing dynasty's complex relationship with gender was reflected in evolving interpretations of Mulan's story. On one hand, Qing ideology promoted strict Neo-Confucian gender norms of female seclusion and chastity. On the other hand, the Manchu women of the ruling elite enjoyed more freedom than Han Chinese women, including the rejection of foot binding and greater public visibility. This tension created space for multiple readings of Mulan's cross-dressing adventure. As the Qing dynasty entered its final decades in the late 19th century, China faced unprecedented challenges from Western imperialism, domestic rebellions, and failing governance. In this context of national crisis, historical tales of loyalty and sacrifice like Mulan's took on renewed significance. Reformers and revolutionaries looking to China's past for models of resistance and renewal found in Mulan an example of patriotic service and personal courage. By the end of the Qing dynasty, Mulan's legend had accumulated layers of meaning over more than a millennium of cultural development. What began as a simple folk ballad had become a complex narrative incorporating elements of Confucian morality, martial heroism, gender transgression, and patriotic sacrifice. Her story had been told and retold across multiple artistic media: poetry, prose fiction, drama, and visual art, each adding new dimensions to her character. With the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, China entered a turbulent modern period, experiencing republican government, warlord fragmentation, Japanese invasion, civil war, and communist revolution. Throughout these dramatic changes, Mulan remained a cultural touchstone, her story reinterpreted to reflect changing social and political circumstances. During the Republican era, 1912 to 1949, reformers promoting women's education and social participation found in Mulan a historical precedent for female capability in traditionally male domains. Early Chinese feminists pointed to her story as evidence that Chinese tradition contained indigenous models of female empowerment, even as they campaigned against foot binding and arranged marriage. The period of Japanese occupation and resistance, 1937 to 1945, saw Mulan portrayed explicitly as a patriotic hero defending China against foreign invasion. Her willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for national defense resonated powerfully during this period of national crisis. Films and plays depicting her story emphasized her courage in battle and unwavering loyalty to country. After the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, state-sponsored interpretations emphasized Mulan's humble origins and her service to the common people. The class dimensions of her story were highlighted, with her portrayed as a representative of the peasantry rising to historical significance through revolutionary action. Gender equality being an official policy of the communist state, Mulan was presented as a forerunner of modern Chinese women who participated fully in social production and national defense. The 1998 animated film Mulan by Disney marked the tale's most significant introduction to global audiences, though it substantially altered many elements of the traditional story. The film sparked renewed interest in the historical and literary origins of Mulan's legend, with scholars and general audiences alike exploring the cultural context that produced the original ballad. In contemporary China, Mulan remains a complex cultural symbol with multiple meanings. She represents traditional virtues of filial piety and loyalty, while simultaneously embodying more modern ideals of female agency and gender equality. Her story bridges historical periods, artistic media, and even cultures, demonstrating the enduring power of a simple tale about a girl who took her father's place in the army. Archaeological evidence continues to inform our understanding of the historical context that might have produced the original Mulan story. Excavations of Northern Wei tombs have revealed details about the material culture, military practices, and gender relations of the period when the ballad likely originated. Artifacts showing women on horseback in northern frontier regions suggest that Mulan's story, while legendary, reflected something of the historical reality of China's borderlands. Scholars continue to debate the historical existence of Mulan herself. While most agree that the ballad represents a legendary rather than historical figure, some local traditions in various parts of China claim Mulan as their own, pointing to specific villages as her birthplace. These competing claims speak to the deep resonance of her story across regions and centuries. What remains most significant about Mulan is not her historical authenticity, but her cultural persistence. From a simple folk ballad to a global multimedia phenomenon, her journey across centuries represents the evolution of Chinese culture itself, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining connection to enduring values of courage, loyalty, and familial devotion. As night settles over the ancient lands once walked by armies and emperors, the whispers of Mulan's legend continue to dance on the wind. Her footprints, neither holy woman's nor holy man's, have left imprints in the dust of centuries, traceable not in archaeological remains, but in the living breath of stories that refuse to fade. The mountains of the north still stand, silent, witnesses to countless warriors who journeyed beyond the passes. Among them, one figure remains distinct, not for the battles won or blood spilled, but for the boundaries crossed and expectations defied. What makes Mulan endure is not the historical accuracy of her tale, but the truth it carries about the human spirit's capacity to transform limitation into possibility. Like the bamboo that bends without breaking, her story has flexed through dynasties and revolutions, each age finding in her what it most needed to see. The daughter who became a soldier, the woman who became a symbol, the simple tale that became a cultural landmark stretching across continents and centuries. The yellow river still flows as it did when the ballad was first sung, carrying silt from distant mountains to the expectant sea. So too does Mulan's story continue to flow through time, gathering the emotional sediment of generations, enriching the cultural soil where new understandings take root. In the quiet hours when sleep approaches, her legend reminds us that beneath the ornate embroidery of empire, and the grand tapestry of civilization lies the simple thread of individual courage, spanning the loom of history with quiet determination. As stars wheel overhead, just as they did above the Northern Way encampments, Mulan's spirit remains, neither conquered nor forgotten, but transformed into something as eternal as China itself.